The monitoring station had been silent. For 63 years, that was not unusual. Station Verith 9 sat at the cold edge of a star system the galaxy had largely ignored, a small, loud, messy system. With one inhabited planet, 7 unremarkable rocks and a single yellow star that burned without ceremony. Species on that one inhabited planet called their home Earth. The Galactic Council called it a problem that was not yet a problem. Senior Monitor Ixural had been stationed at Verith 9 for 11 years. She was Velari, tall, green-scaled, with amber eyes that could read a data screen. From across the room, she was 600 years old, experienced beyond measure, and deeply, profoundly bored. Her job was to watch, that was all. Watch the humans, log their progress, file her reports, and drink the terrible warm liquid her station's food unit insisted was a passable substitute for Velari spice broth. It was not a passable substitute. She was drinking it anyway when the alert came. It was not a loud alert. It was not the kind of flashing red alarm that meant weapons fire or an incoming fleet. It was a small chime, the kind the system used when sensor data came back with readings it did not understand. Zerval had heard that chime perhaps twice in 11 years, and both times it had turned out to be a calibration error. She sat down her cup and walked to the sensor console. The drone data was sitting there blinking, quietly waiting to be reviewed. It had come from Drone Unit 7, which she had positioned near the outer edge of the solar system, past the large ringed planet the humans called Saturn, drifting in the cold dark between the system's edge and the void beyond. It was a routine placement. Drone Unit 7. Watch for human ships testing in deep space. The humans had been testing small experimental vessels out there for about 3 years. Nothing special, nothing that caused concern. Dixer pulled up the data. She read it once. She read it again. Then she sat down very slowly in her chair and read it a third time. The data showed a human vessel designation, unknown, the size of what they called a corvette, sitting at a fixed point beyond Neptune. That was normal. The drone had been tracking it for 6 hours. Also normal. The vessel had been running what looked like engine tests, small bursts of thrust, some kind of energy fluctuation in its rear section. Normal. Then at 3:12 station time, the vessel had simply vanished. Not exploded, not broken apart, not drifted out of sensor range. It had been there one moment and gone the next, and the drone sensors had caught it clearly, with no signal degradation, no interference, no equipment fault. The energy reading spiked once, briefly, like a stone hitting water, and then the space where the ship had been was empty. Ixel stared at the screen. Her scaled fingers moved slowly over the console, pulling up the next data frame. 11 seconds later, the ship reappeared, not near Saturn, not near Neptune, not anywhere in the solar system at all. It reappeared 4.3 light-years away in the cold space between Sol and the star the humans called Proxima Centauri, hanging therein the dark for 30 seconds before, or folding back and returning somehow to its original position near Neptune, as if nothing had happened, did not move. For a long time, she pulled up the drone's diagnostic report. All systems functioning normally, no sensor errors, no interference from solar activity. The data had been recorded cleanly, stored correctly, and transmitted without any packet loss. The reading was accurate. She ran the numbers manually, 4.3 light years in 11 seconds. That was not a speed, that was not even a concept that belonged in the same conversation as speed, the fastest Velari ship in existence. The military courier vessel, Shanvar, pride of the fleet, could cross 4 light years in roughly 9 days with its best slipgate corridor transit. The humans had just crossed the same distance in 11 seconds without a gate, without a corridor, without any infrastructure at all. She sent the data to the 3 nearest council monitoring outposts and marked the transmission with a priority red flag, the second highest alert level in the council's communication system. She had never used a priority red flag before. She did not use priority black, the highest level, because she told herself she needed to be sure first. She was already sure. She just needed a moment. The responses came back within 2 hours, which was fast, considering the distances involved. The first response was from the Quar listening post near the outer drift. Single line, data received. Verification requested, please confirm. No equipment fault. The second response was from the Solon relay hub at Corridor 9 viewing standby. The third response came from a Dorothy deep space observatory, and it was longer than the others. It listed 7 alternative explanations for the sensor reading, went through each one methodically, and concluded by eliminating all 7. Final line of the Dorothy message read: we have no remaining explanation that does not confirm the original reading. Escalate immediately. Ixarel escalated. She sent a full priority black transmission to On Prime, the seat of the Galactic Council, and included all drone, all sensor data, all 3 verification responses, and her own written report. She kept her report short and factual. She described what the data showed without adding opinion. She noted the speed, the distance, the time, the absence of any known mechanism. At the end of the report, she added 1 line of personal observation, something she had not planned to write, but found herself writing anyway. The vessel returned to its original position calmly. There was no visible distress, no emergency signal, no communication of any kind. It simply went and came back and continued its engine tests as though nothing had occurred. She sent the report and then sat back and looked out the station's narrow viewport at the distant smear of light that was the Sol system. Somewhere in that light, on a small blue planet, a species that had been riding horses less than 500 years ago had just done something the galaxy's most advanced civilizations had been attempting to do for over 3,000 years. They had folded space. On Prime, the Grand Hall of the Galactic Council was a structure so old that 3 of its founding member species no longer existed. Its walls were layered with the seals of 212 civilizations. Its central chamber could hold 1,000 delegates. It had hosted negotiations, treaties, declarations of peace, and declarations of war. It had heard every kind of news imaginable across more than 12,000 years of galactic history. It had never quite heard news like this. The Council's emergency session was called within 48 hours of transmission. That was extremely fast. Getting delegates to agree on a meeting time across multiple star systems usually took weeks. Fact that it happened in 2 days told everyone present exactly how seriously the signal was being taken. The chamber filled slowly. Species arrived in their various forms. the tall crystalline they, compact and insectoid Quoreth, the smooth-skinned Solon with their wide, pale eyes, the heavy-bodied Marek who communicated partly through low-frequency sound that other species felt rather than heard. They took their seats and pulled up their translation units and looked at the data that had been distributed ahead of the session. The hall was quieter than usual. The Velari senior delegate, a different official from named Council Tashvin, opened the session by simply playing the drone footage on the central hollow field. Without comment, every delegate in the room watched the human ship vanish and reappear. Some watched it twice, a few watched it more times than that. Then the talking started. The first argument was that the data was wrong. This argue lasted about 12 minutes before the verification. Reports from 3 separate monitoring posts killed it completely. The second argument was that the humans had somehow accessed a pre-existing spatial anomaly, a natural fold point in space that had not been mapped yet. This argument lasted longer, nearly 40 minutes before the DRI physicist delegate dismantled it with 3 calculations that showed no natural point existed within 30 light years of that location. The third argument, offered quietly by the eldest delegate in the room, the ancient Dorothy known as Council Horeth, who was over 4,000 years old and had attended more council sessions than most civilizations had. Years of history was not really an argument at all, it was a statement. Council Horeth had not spoken yet during the session. He had simply sat in his seat at the far end of the high arc of delegate tables, his crystalline body catching the chamber's soft light, his old eyes watching the Hala field replay the footage again and again. When he finally spoke, the chamber went silent almost immediately, because Council Horeth did not speak unless he had something to say. He said they were not supposed to reach this point for another 400 years. No one responded right away. The words sat in the chamber like a weight, because what he meant was not just that the humans had surprised them. What he meant was that the Council's entire model for predicting the development of emerging species, a model refined over thousands of years, tested against hundreds of civilizations, considered one of the most reliable tools in the Council's long history, had just been proven catastrophically completely wrong. Ixel, still at her station near the Sol system, did not know what was being said on Prime. She had sent her report and was now back at her console watching Drone Unit 7's live feed. The human ship was still out there, running its quiet tests. It looked so small against the dark. Dwar was arguing about a number. The number was 0.0033, and it represented the harmonic drift recorded in the fold drive's third field layer during the last transit. To most people, 0.003 was not a number worth raising one's voice over. To Pryanair, it was practically a personal insult. She was standing in the engineering bay of the UN Copernicus Joint Earth Space Force and European Space Agency research vessel, currently sitting at the edge of the Sol system. Past Neptune's orbit, the ship was not large. It was practical, gray, and designed for function over appearance. The kind of vessel built by a committee of engineers who had been given a clear goal and a fixed budget, told to stop asking for more of either. Priya was 39 years old. She had a streak of gray in her black hair that she had stopped trying to cover 2 years ago, a habit of drinking cold coffee because she always forgot to drink it while it was hot, and a mind that simply did not stop. She had been working on the full drive concept since she was a doctoral student, which meant she had been living with this idea for over a decade, and she was not going to accept a harmonic drift of 0.003 just because 3 successful transits had occurred. Commander Elias O.C. leaned against the far wall of the bay and watched her with a patient expression of a man who had been listening to arguments about harmonic drift for a very long time. He was the ship's commanding officer, tall, calm, with the kind of steady voice that made people feel like situations were under control even when they were not. He had a way of letting Priya finish her thoughts before speaking that she did not always appreciate but always needed. It completed the transit, he said when she paused for breath. It completed the transit with a drift, she said, pointing at the diagnostic screen, as though it had personally disappointed her. Look at field layer 3, look at it. I'm looking at it. Does that look acceptable to you? The ship went 4 light years in 11 seconds and then came back in one piece. As if we scale this drive up, which we will, that's the whole point. A drift of 0.003 in field layer 3 becomes a drift of something much larger, and a drift of something much larger means the fold geometry gets sloppy, and sloppy fold geometry means the end point is not where we calculated it should be, and instead of arriving near Proxima, we arrive inside a rock. Elias considered this. All right, he said, log the drift, we'll recalibrate before the next run. Priya nodded, satisfied, and turned back to her screens. That was how the crew of the Copernicus handled the fact that they had just broken the most fundamental speed barrier in the known universe. There was no celebration. There was no standing on the observation deck staring at the stars in quiet wonder. There was a data log, an engineering argument, and a list of things to fix before the next test. The drive itself sat in the ship's rear section behind 3 layers of shielded plating. It did not look like something that had changed history. It looked like a large metal cylinder wrapped in conduit lines and monitor nodes with a faint blue glow at its center that pulsed slowly when active. Had been staring at versions of this S for 11 years. She no longer found it particularly impressive to look at. She found it impressive in the way that a surgeon finds a scalpel impressive, as a tool precise and purposeful did exactly what it was supposed to do. The narrow continuum fold drive, named after Priya and the late Dr. Kofi Akiper, her mentor and partner in the early theoretical work, who had died of a stroke 4 years before seeing his idea become real, worked on a principle that most physicists had dismissed as mathematically elegant but practically useless. It did not move the ship through space. It did not accelerate the ship to any speed at all. What it did was far simpler and far stranger. It identified 2 points in space and convinced the universe very briefly that those 2 points were the same point. Then the ship stepped through. The fold lasted roughly 1/10 of a second from inside the vessel. The power cost was enormous, was why humanity had needed 23 years of fusion reactor development before the drive became practical. Principle had been there in Kofi Akiper's notebook since 2351, clear, elegant, and ignored. Most of the theoretical physics community had been chasing dark energy corridor models because that was what the rumored alien technology was thought to use. Kepper had looked at the same problem from a different direction, asked a different question, and found a different door. Pissa thought about him often on days like this down in Earth's Geneva command hub. The transit data had arrived in the night shift. A junior analyst named Marcus Ewan had been the first to process it. He had pulled up the coordinates, run the timestamp comparison, verified the full duration, and sat very still at his desk for about 90 seconds. Then he had turned to the analyst sitting next to him, a woman named Farida, who was supposed to be reviewing satellite maintenance logs, and said very quietly, "I think we just broke the universe's speed limit." Farida had looked up. "What should we tell someone?" Marcus said. "We work for Earth Command." Farida said. "We tell Earth Command." "Right," Marcus said. "Yeah, obviously." He paused. "Do you think they know what this means?" "I think you should send the report and stop asking me questions," Farida said, and went back to her satellite logs, though she did not read a single word of them for the next 20 minutes. The report went up the chain. By morning, the director of the UN Space Exploration Force had read it. By afternoon, 3 heads of government had been quietly briefed. By evening, the data had been classified at the highest level, and the Copernicus had been ordered to return to Earth for a full debrief. The crew received the order without much reaction. They had been expecting it. Priya saved her current calibration work, backed it up in 3 separate locations out of habit, and told the ship's pilot, a young Finnish officer named Lieutenant Hanna Varon, that she begin the return transit whenever she was ready. Hanna ran the pre-fold checklist in about 4 minutes. It was a long checklist. She had written much of it herself. "Ready," she said. "Go ahead." Commander O said. The drive pulsed. The faint blue glow in the rear section brightened for one breath, and then the Copernicus was no longer past Neptune. It was sitting in near-Earth orbit 47 seconds after departing with a harmonic drift in field layer 3 of precisely 0.003. Logged it immediately. She would have it fixed by next week. The crew was debriefed over 2 days in a secure facility outside Geneva. They told their story calmly, answered every question carefully, and handed over all data without hesitation. They were scientists and officers. Transparency was the job. At the end of the second day, the director of the Yusef sat across from Commander OC and said, the expression of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. "You understand what you've done?" OC thought about that. "We've built an engine that works," he said. "The next step is building a better one." The director nodded slowly. "And the step after that, we go further," OC said. Simply. The director leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He was thinking about 100 things at once: security implications, political fallout, the inevitable question of what the rest of the galaxy would think when they found out. He was thinking about the fact that he had been receiving unusual signals in council monitoring frequencies for the past 3 months, signals that his intelligence team had quietly concluded were alien surveillance probes repositioning themselves around the Sol system. He had not told the Copernicus crew about those probes. He would need to soon. 3 more drives in final testing, Oi said, reading the director's expression correctly, if not completely. Priya has already redesigned the field layer Architecture based on today's data. The second-generation drive will be 40% more efficient. How long? 8 months, OC said. Maybe 6 if she stops sleeping. The director looked at him. She sleeps, OC. Almost smiled occasionally. When the formal report was filed, Commander OC's official summary of the Copernicus Deep Space Trials submitted to USF Command on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2387. It ran to 41 pages of technical data, engineering notes, transit logs, and safety minutes. It was thorough, detailed, and written in the precise language of people who took their work seriously. In Box 14 of the standard mission cover form, where officers were asked to summarize the mission status in a single phrase, Commander Elias Os had written 2 words. He had looked at the field for a moment before writing them. He had thought about what those 11 seconds had meant. He had thought about Kofiaker's notebooks and Priya's 11 years, the cold, dark beyond Neptune, where a small gray ship had briefly touched the unreachable. Then he had written routine, successful, and submitted the report and gone to find coffee. Grand Hall of the Galactic Council had not hosted an emergency Tier 1 session in 1,200 years. The last time had been the Keth Swarm Crisis, a period so dark in galactic history that most species did not teach it to their young without first making sure the young were ready for it. The KTH had been a consuming force, mindless and vast, that had devoured 4 solar systems before the Council had united its military fleets in a response that cost more lives than most modern generations could count. That event had left permanent scars on the Council's memory and on its architecture. The emergency chambers at the base of the Grand Hall, the sealed rooms used only for Tier 1 sessions, still had blast doors rated for orbital bombardment. No one had needed those blast doors in 12 centuries. They were open now. Delegate ships had been arriving at On Prime for 5 days. Planet itself was a world of soft orange and vast cities built from pale stone, a place of order and ceremony and great political age. Its spaceports were among the largest in the galaxy, capable of receiving hundreds of vessels simultaneously. Even so, the volume of incoming traffic had caused the port authority to extend landing queues by 2 full rotations. 300 delegates from across the known galaxy arriving from every direction, their vessels representing designs and engineering philosophies so different from one another that the port controllers had needed to issue special docking guidance for 17 species whose ships did not fit standard berth configurations. The irony of this had not escaped anyone. 300 representatives of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations struggling to park their ships efficiently, gathering to discuss species that had just covered 4 light years in 11 seconds. The chamber itself was enormous. Its ceiling rose so high that the upper reaches were always slightly dim, even with full lighting. The delegate tables curved in a wide arc around the central hollow field, circular projection platform that could display data, charts, footage, maps in full 3-dimensional detail. Behind each table sat the assigned delegates for each species, flanked by their advisors, translation units built into every seat. The sound of 212 civil isolations settling into chairs and adjusting equipment filled the room with a low, constant murmur that gradually faded as the session was called to order. Council HFY of the V30 opened the presentation. She was precise and composed. She showed the drone footage first, the Copernicus vanishing and reappearing, and then walked through the verification data from all three monitoring posts in careful sequence. She presented the calculations, the timeline, the confirmed absence of any natural fold anomaly, and the conclusion that no alternative explanation remained. When she finished, the chamber was quiet. Then, as it had the first time, everything broke open at once. The arguments came from every direction, and they were not calm. The Morrow delegates, heavy, slow-moving, deeply conservative in their thinking, declared immediately that the data required another full cycle of verification before any conclusions could be drawn. They had been saying this for 6 days since the preliminary briefing, and they were still saying it now. Their reasoning was not irrational. The Muro civilization had made a catastrophic strategic error 2,000 years ago based on incomplete intelligence, and the memory of it ran deep in their institutional culture. They did not move on incomplete data. They simply did not. Quara Chavist delegation by contrast had already moved well past the question of whether the data was accurate. Their chief delegate, the ancient insectoid scholar Senkal, had spent the past 5 days pulling up every record the council held on human development. He had assembled a timeline so detailed and so damning that when he displayed it on the central hollow field, several delegates simply stared at it without speaking. The timeline showed in clean visual format pace at which humanity had advanced through the standard developmental markers that the council used to classify emerging species. Strong transport to powered flight, 56 years. Powered flight to nuclear capability, 42 years. Nuclear capability to first orbital space flight, 12 years. First space flight to permanent off-world habitation, 31 years. Off-world habitation to interplanetary travel network, 40 years. Interplanetary network to deep space exploration, 27 years. Deep space exploration to open space FTL transit, 31 years. Senal let the numbers sit on the hollow field without comment for a long moment. Then he said the average time for a species to move from atmospheric flight to FTL transit across all council members with recorded data, 2,300 years. Some took longer, none took less than 900. Humanity has done it in 241. No one spoke. I am not presenting this as a threat assessment, Sen continued. I am presenting it as a factual context for this discussion. The question before us is not whether the humans are dangerous. Question is whether we understand what kind of species we're dealing with, and based on this data, I would suggest that our understanding has been fundamentally incorrect. The silence after that was different from the silence after the drone footage. It was heavier, more personal, because the representatives in that room all belonged to species that were proud of what they had built over thousands and thousands of years. The Solon had their ancient philosophy, traditions, and their diplomatic history. The Valari had their military engineering honed across 6 centuries of interstellar service. The Dorothy had their science, deep, patient, meticulous science that had produced some of the galaxy's most important theoretical work. All of them had reached their current level through time, through effort, through generation. after generation of slow, steady work, and a species that had been drawing in the dirt with sticks, in historical terms, had just walked past all of it. It stung. No one said it out loud, but it stung. The most aggressive voice in the chamber belonged to Delegate Commander Reth of the Merrick Military Council. He was not a diplomat. He had been sent because the Moroc's military had insisted on representation in this session and had chosen him specifically because he was not the kind of delegate who would soften his position to spare feelings. We are sitting here analyzing timelines and development rates, Rithgoes said, his deep voice carrying easily across the chamber without a sound amplifier. While a species with no treaty obligations, no council oversight, and no established foreign policy has just gained the ability to appear anywhere in the galaxy without warning, I do not care about their historical pace of development. I care about what they can do right now today with an engine that we cannot match. We don't know that we can't match it, said Mira Das of the Solon. Can we? Breath turned toward her. Show me the Solon research program that is 6 months from an open space full drive. Merida Das did not answer that. There was no answer that was useful. She was a small figure at the Solon table. Her species was slight and pale with large dark eyes that gave them an expression of permanent attentiveness. She was the Slen's chief diplomatic officer, a position she had held for 40 years and expected to hold for 40 more. She had a reputation for pragmatism that occasionally frustrated her own government and frequently frustrated everyone else's, because she had a habit of saying things that were true at moments when people would prefer to hear things that were comfortable. I want to say something about their behavior, she said, and the chamber listened because Myra's rarely asked for the floor without having carefully about what she was going to do with it. They tested this engine quietly. They did not broadcast it. They did not fly to the nearest council world and demand recognition. They went to Proxima Century 4 light years and they came home. Then they filed a report and went about their day. She paused. Does that sound like the behavior of a species planning to threaten anyone? It sounds like the behavior of a species being careful, Brethos said, which is not the same thing as a species being peaceful. No, as agreed, but it is worth noting the session went on for 9 hours. Proposals were made and debated. The most extreme proposal, a full blockade of the Sol system restricting all human movement beyond their own planets, was put to a preliminary and failed, but not by as wide a margin as Meridos would have liked. A second proposal, immediate covert action to disable the drive technology, was withdrawn before it reached a vote when the Quarth delegation made clear they would formally oppose it, and the procedural delay would last months. What passed finally in the early hours of the second day was a compromise. A diplomatic delegation would be sent to the Sol system. First contact would be made officially and formally through the Council's established protocols. The escort fleet assigned to the diplomatic vessels would be heavy, 14 warships, fully armed, but the lead vessels would carry diplomats, not soldiers. The mission's objective was information and relationship, not control. It was Myra's thought as she voted in favor of it. Reasonable decision made by frightened people trying very hard not to look frightened. She had participated in enough council history to know that this was frequently the best that could be Expected, Council Horace had through the entire session in the same stillness he had occupied during the emergency meeting days before. He had not spoken again after his opening observation. He had simply watched and listened, turned things over in a mind that had been thinking about galactic history for 4,000 years. As the chamber began to clear, a junior Dratha aide approached him quietly and asked if he needed anything. Horth was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the central hollow field was still displaying Senkal's timeline, the human developmental arc, steep and short and almost violent in its upward climb. Tell me, Earth said to the aide without looking away from the display, when our ancestors first built the slipgate network, when they first truly understood what they had made, what did they feel? The aide was not sure how to answer that. It was not a question with a practical answer. Pride, the aide offered after a moment. I suppose. Crystalline surface caught the fading light of the hollow field. Timeline still glowed in front of him, that impossible upward line of human progress. Yes, he said quietly. Pride. He paused. I wonder what they feel. The council fleet crossed the helipause of the Sol system on a Thursday morning, Earth time. It was a significant fleet by any standard. 14 warships formed the outer ring, long, angular vessels with weapons arrays that could reduce a small moon to rubble in under an hour. Inside that ring, 2 diplomatic cruisers moved in careful formation, their hulls painted in the pale silver that the council used to signal peaceful intent. The whole formation moved at a steady, measured pace, broadcasting on all standard galactic frequencies the formal greeting that the council's diplomatic office had spent 2 weeks composing, translating into every known human language, and then composing again, because the first draft had been described by 2 Solan linguists as sounding accidentally threatening. The final version was gracious, calm, and carefully worded. It acknowledged humanity's presence in the cosmos. It offered the hand of galactic cooperation. It spoke of shared futures and mutual benefit. It had been reviewed by 11 separate committees. Fleet Admiral Sarah, commanding the escort warships, from the bridge of her vessel, thought the message was too soft. She did not say this out loud because she was a professional, but she thought it. She had spent 30 years in the council's military service, and in her experience, being too polite at first contact sent the wrong signal. You needed to establish clearly and early that you were operating from a position of strength. The fleet was 15 minutes past the helipause when her sensor officer reported something unexpected. Admiral, we are being scanned by the diplomatic vessels. No, Admiral, from the 3rd planet. Saravin turned to her console. The scan was thorough, not an accidental brush of passive sensor radiation, but a deliberate, focused, active scan of the kind that military vessels use to assess unknown contacts. It swept the entire fleet, each ship individually, and then repeated. It was also, she noted with some discomfort, quite good. The resolution was better than she would have expected from what the council's files classified as an early-stage space faring species. They know we're here, the sensor officer said somewhat unnecessarily. Sarah kept her expression neutral. They've known since we crossed the helipause, she said. We knew they would detect us eventually. What she had not expected was how quickly, how precisely. She sent a flag to the lead diplomatic cruiser and said nothing more about it. Aboard the diplomatic cruiser, On's voice, Ambassador Drosio of the Velari was reviewing his opening remarks for the 14th time when the flag came through. From Saravan, he read it, set it aside, and went back to his remarks. He was 60 years old by Belthari standards, young for an ambassador, but the council's diplomatic office had decided that a younger face might be less intimidating. Dross was not sure he agreed with the reasoning, but he had not been asked. The fleet held its position near the edge of the system, broadcasting its greeting on all frequencies, and waited. The response came 4 minutes and 11 seconds later. It was not a text transmission. It was not a formal diplomatic reply encoded in council standard protocol. It was a live video signal, and it came through with such clean resolution that several crew members on the bridge of the On's voice actually flinched slightly when the face appeared on the central screen. Without warning, the face belonged to a human woman. She was perhaps 50 years old by human reckoning, dark-skinned, calm-eyed with gray stray hair pulled back neatly. She was wearing a dark, formal jacket with a small blue emblem on the lapel. Behind her, slightly out of focus, a large room was visible with long tables and many other humans seated or standing, all watching the screen. She was holding a small ceramic cup. "Good morning," she said in English, which the translation units caught immediately. Voice was steady and warm. "I'm Secretary General Amara Dio of the United Nations of Earth. We've been expecting contact of some kind for a while now. I hope your journey was comfortable." She paused with the faint suggestion of a smile. "Would you like to begin?" On the bridge of the On's voice, Ambassador Drossil stared at the screen for a moment longer than was perhaps diplomatic. He had prepared for several possible opening scenarios. The scenario in which a human official answered a first contact transmission. 4-minute casually mentioned that they had been expecting this visit was not one of them. He recovered quickly. He was a professional secretary general, he said, keeping his voice measured. "I am Ambassador Dial, representing the Galactic Council on behalf of 212 civilizations across this galaxy. I extend greetings to the people of Earth." Dio nodded once graciously. "Honored," she said, "and we extend the same to you and to your council." There was a brief pause, the natural kind that happens when people are deciding how to proceed. And then Drossil began the formal portion of the opening address. He spoke about the council's history, its structure, its purpose. He described the vast community of spacefaring species that had built a network of cooperation over thousands of years. He spoke about the possibilities that membership in the council could offer to a young spacefaring civilization. He was thorough and clear and respectful. Dio listened with her full attention, occasionally making small notes on a pad beside her. When he finished, she thanked him. Then she said, "I'd like to ask a straightforward question, if I may. You've arrived with 14 warships as an escort. We've cataloged all of them. I understand there are diplomatic considerations in how a delegation like this is assembled, and I'm not raising it as an accusation. I'm raising it because I think it's more useful to acknowledge these things directly than to work around them. Can you tell me what level of concern specifically prompted that particular fleet composition?" In his earpiece, Dial heard his deputy whisper, She counted the ships. He had not expected a direct question about the escort fleet within the first 10 minutes of the conversation. Paired talking points did not cover this. He took a breath, reminded himself that he was a professional, and said, Council takes the safety of its diplomatic personnel seriously. The escort is standard for first contact missions. Dio looked at him with polite patience. It was a look that did not argue with him and did not agree with him. It simply waited. There was dialogue added after a moment's discussion within the council regarding the nature of your recent technological development. It was felt that a cautious approach was appropriate. The fold drive. Dio said, yes, we thought that might be part of it, she said in a tone that suggested this was not a surprise at all, and that the part she was not saying out loud was that they had thought that before the fleet even left its home port. We'd be very happy to discuss it. I should mention that we have 3 additional drives in final testing, tint, and our second-generation design is already significantly more efficient than the one we tested last month. We think there's a lot of potential for shared research in the Geneva facility, where the Earthside diplomatic team was operating. Dr. Priere was watching the live feed on a secondary screen, while simultaneously reviewing her field layer recalibration notes. She heard Dio mention the 3 additional drives and smiled slightly, not because it was strategic, because it was simply true, and she was glad someone had said it. Muraz of the Solon was watching the exchange via a relay link from the On's voice. She had insisted on being patched in despite her colleagues' objections, because she counseled exactly this would happen, and she intended to attend herself be right about it. She was watching the Secretary General's face, and she was watching Droz's face, and what she saw was the same thing she had tried to explain to the council for 2 weeks. These people were not afraid. They had not been frightened into cooperation or impressed into submission. They had simply prepared quietly and practically conversation that they knew was coming, and now they were having it. Saravan, still on the bridge of her warship, received a quiet update from her intelligence officer. The update informed her that the humans had been tracking alien surveillance probes in the Sol system for at least 4 years, had cataloged most of them without disabling any, and had been maintaining a first contact response team on active standby for the past 8 months. The intelligence officer added at the bottom of the update a personal note that simply read, they were ready before we arrived. Saravan read it twice, then she set it aside and watched the diplomatic feed. The conversation continued for 3 hours. Dio and LT Unk and GT's team was methodical and well-prepared, asking clear questions about the council's structure and governance, offering information about Earth's political situation in return, carefully, neither accepting nor rejecting any specific proposal until they had fully understood it. Twice, a human advisor passed yellow a note, and she paused to read it before answering. Once she asked for a 5-minute break to consult with her team off-screen. When the session concluded, Clear's throat, Draciel signed off with the formal council diplomatic closing. Dio thanked him, wished the fleet safe travel, and sit forward to their next conversation. The screen went dark. Dio sat in his chair for a moment. His deputy, a young Velari named Council Terrace, leaned over and said quietly, that went well, I think. She counted The ships before we introduced ourselves, Dross Weil said she knew. About the fold drive surveillance, she had 3 additional drives ready to mention in the first 15 minutes, paused. We came here to assess them, I believe. They have assessed us at least as thoroughly. On-Prime Counsel Horeth received a relay summary of the exchange. He read it slowly in the quiet of his private chamber with the pale orange light of the planet's evening coming through the high windows. When he finished reading, he set the summary aside and looked at the light for a while. Then he said to no one in particular, because he was alone, they were ready before us, 4 words, the same 4 words he had spoken in the council chamber weeks ago, but carrying a different weight now than it had been. A lament for a model that had failed. A reckoning with the limits of the council's predictions. Now it was something closer to recognition, even perhaps to a kind of quiet respect that he had not expected to feel for a species he had spent 4,000 years cataloging as a distant minor concern. They had been ready. They had prepared without being told to prepare. They had watched the watchers without revealing that they were watching, and when the knock finally came at their door, they had opened it calmly, offered something warm to drink, and begun the conversation on their own terms. Horeth had lived long enough to understand that this was rarer than any engine and far more dangerous and far more interesting. 6 months after first contact, the galaxy was quietly becoming a different place. It did not announce this. There were no broadcasts declaring that something fundamental had shifted, no ceremonies marking the moment. The old order had begun, slowly and without drama, to rearrange itself. The change moved the way deep water moves, invisible at the surface, powerful beneath, reshaping the bottom of things without asking anyone's permission. At the center of it all was a document. The Galactic Council Charter had not been seriously revised in 900 years. It was a long document, formally, almost beautifully long in the way that things written by committee over many centuries tend to become, full of precedent and cross-reference and carefully balanced language that managed to say a great deal while committing firmly to very little. It was in the opinion of most council members, who were honest about it, in need of significant updating. No one had ever done the updating because no one had wanted to take on the political cost of suggesting it. Humanity had asked for 3 weeks to review the charter before giving their formal response to the council's invitation to membership. They came back with 17 amendments. The amendments were not aggressive, they were not hostile. They were precise. They addressed 1 by 117 specific areas of the charter where the language created conditions that human legal scholars had identified as structurally unfair to newer member species, areas where voting weights fared founding members regardless of population or contribution, areas where technology sharing protocols could be blocked indefinitely by a single senior member's objection, areas where the Charter's conflict resolution process had no defined timeline, which in practice meant it could be delayed forever by the parties who benefited from delay. Every amendment was accompanied by a written justification of no more than 2 pages, written in plain language that explained the problem clearly and proposed a specific solution. The council's reaction had ranged from outrage to uncomfortable silence, with a significant portion landing somewhere in the territory of privately agreeing that the humans had noticed things that others had been quietly aware of for centuries but had never pushed because pushing carried costs. Myriads of the Solon had read all 17 amendments in one sitting, set the document down, and then sent a SASL message to the Secretary General through the new diplomatic channel that had been established between and the Council. The message said, "I would like at some point to understand how your legal skull identified these 17 specific points in 3 weeks when they had no prior knowledge of the Charter, my own civilizations. Scholars have been working on council reform proposals 40 years and have produced 11 amendments, 3 of which overlap with yours." Dio and LT Unk and GT's reply came back within the day. "We gave the Charter to a team of constitutional lawyers, 3 political scientists, and a graduate student in international relations who apparently stayed up for 36 hours. The graduate student found most of them pass clear's throat on. Your regards." Mira Das had read that response 3 times, and each time she had felt the same combination of amusement and something she could only describe as admiration. On Prime, the debate over the amendments was ongoing. It would be ongoing for some time. The old powers, the Marek, the elder Villari houses, the Darthy institutional bloc were not pleased. Not because the amendments were wrong, because accepting them meant accepting a shift in the balance of influence that had held for centuries. The newer council species, the ones who had joined within the last few hundred years, had read the amendments with considerable interest. Several had quietly indicated they would support them. Council Horeth, watching the political landscape shift from his long vantage point, said nothing publicly. Privately he had told Mira Doas that the amendments would eventually pass, perhaps not all 17, but most of them, because the argument for them was simply too clear and too well made to dismiss forever. He had also said something else Muradas had written down because she wanted to remember it. In my experience, civilizations that change the galaxy are not the ones who arrive loudest. They are the ones who, once they arrive, make everyone else look at things they had been choosing not to see. But the real story, the one that would matter most in the long run, the one that future historians would spend centuries examining, was not happening in the council chamber. It was happening 40 light years away. The unsus Copernicus, too, was a larger vessel than its predecessor. It had been built in 8 months, which was fast even by human standards, cause the USF had moved resources into it the moment the first fold drive was confirmed successful. It was crewed by 23 people, carried a second generation Nayaka fold drive in its rear section, and had 2 passengers who were not human. Telvos was a Solon engineer. He was 190 years old, which placed him in early middle age by his species reckoning, and he had spent the better part of 2 centuries studying FTL theory. He was widely considered one of the foremost experts in fold space mathematics in the Solon civilization, and possibly in the galaxy. He had requested permission to observe the Copernicus II trials the moment the Solon government had been briefed on the drive's existence. The request had gone through channels with unusual speed because Miradas had quietly noted to the relevant officials that refusing would be a missed opportunity of historic proportions. The second non-human crew member was Senal's Assistant, a young Quarth archivist. Named Ventes, she was there not as an engineer but as a historian. She had made a formal case to the Quarth Archive Council that being present for the Kapernaka's first deep transit was the most significant archival opportunity in living memory, and the council had agreed because it was true. Doctor had spent the first 3 days of the voyage making Telvos uncomfortable. Not intentionally, she had simply treated him the way she treated everyone, as a colleague who needed to understand the work, and had proceeded to walk him through the fold drive's theoretical framework at her normal pace. Her normal pace was by the experience of everyone who had worked with her rather fast. Telvos was a brilliant engineer. He understood FTL mathematics at a level that most beings never reached, but the framework Priya was explaining did not map onto any theoretical structure he had previously encountered because it had not been built from the existing theoretical structures. Kofi Akaper had approached the problem from a direction that the wider galactic physics community had never considered, and Priya had spent 11 years developing and extending that original idea into something thingical. The result was a system of concepts that connected to known physics at the edges, but was at its core entirely new. On the 4th day, Telvos had sat across from Priya at the small engineering table in the research compartment and said very quietly, "I want to understand something, the dead end point in fold theory, the dimensional resistance barrier that has stopped every known attempt at open space folding. You're aware of the sorrow limit," Priya said. "Yes, we know about it. Your drive passes through it," Telvos said. "The mathematics show it clearly. The theoretical consensus for 800 years has been that the sorrow limit cannot be bypassed without energy requirements that exceed what any practical system could produce." "Right," Priya said, "because everyone was trying to push through it." Telvos waited. "We don't push through it," Priya said. She pulled up the relevant section of the drive's mathematical framework on the table's small screen. "We ask it to move. The full geometry approach is the limit. Laterally, not frontally. The limit is a resistance to direct pressure. It has almost no resistance to a tangential approach at the right harmonic frequency." She tapped the screen. "Kofi figured that out in 2351. Took us another 30 years to find the right frequency." Telvos looked at the screen for a long time. He was quiet for so long that Priya almost asked if something was wrong. Then he said, "My civilization's best theoretical physicists have been pressing directly against the sorrow limit for 800 years." His voice was careful and even. "We never considered approaching it from the side." "No one did," Priya said. "We didn't know we were supposed to be impressed by it, so we looked at it differently." Telvos was still for another moment. Then he said, "I need to write something down," and reached for a notepad with the focused expression of someone who had just seen clearly and suddenly the solution to a problem they had been carrying for a very long time. Ventes, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the compartment with her archival recorder running, made a small note in her log. "Day 4 Solon. Theoretical breakthrough observed. Suggest archive designation primary. Historical record, the transit itself happened on day 7, 40 light years, the largest single-fold jump attempted in human history." Priya had recalibrated the field layers 4 times before she Was satisfied. Lieutenant Hannah Varon had run the navigation calculations twice independently and then asked Telvos to check them, which he did, spending 2 hours on the task and confirming them with a precision that impressed even Priya. Commander Osi called the ship to transit readiness at 6 Huns Road. The Copernicus II sat in deep space, well outside the Sol system, toward a destination that no human vessel had ever reached. Outside the viewports there was only the dark and stars. Drive is ready, you said. Navigation is confirmed, Hannah said. All crew secured, the first officer reported. OC looked at the forward viewport for a moment, then execute. Full drive pulsed, the pale blue glow in the rear section brightened, and there was a single instant, a fraction of a second that Priya had never been able to adequately describe, and had stopped trying where the GL stars ahead seemed to lean slightly, as though the universe had taken a breath. Then they were somewhere else, 40 light years from home, new stars on the view screen system ahead of them that no human eye had ever seen from this proximity. Quiet hum of the drive cycling D to stand by, the soft sound of the ship systems running their post-transit diagnostics. No one spoke for a while. Telvos was standing near the forward viewport. He had traveled this distance before many times in his life, slipgate corridors that had taken days. He had never arrived this way, stepping through fold from the other side of a void that his civilization had once considered an absolute barrier. He was looking at the stars ahead of them, and his expression was not the expression of a scientist analyzing data. It was quieter than that, more personal. Vintes had her recorder running. She was documenting everything. She would note later in the formal archive entry that this moment marked the first time a Solon and a Quarth had traveled beyond the Council's map transit network in the same vessel as a human. She would note the technical details and the timestamp and the exact coordinates. But what she would remember when she was old and had seen many things was the way Telvos looked at those new stars, and the way Dr. N looked at her drive diagnostics with an expression of complete professional satisfaction, and the way Commander OC's face held something simple and steady and certain. As he opened the mission log, he filled in the standard fields: timestamp, coordinates, crew status, transit duration, less than a second. As always, he reached box 14. He thought for a moment, as he always did. He thought about the Copernicus. He thought about Priya's 11 years in Kofi Akafer's notebooks. He thought about the Council fleet that had arrived at their doorstep, thinking it would find a species looking up in wonder, and found instead a species looking back with level eyes. He thought about 17 amendments to a 900-year-old charter and a graduate student who had stayed 36 hours. He thought about Telvos at the viewport and Vantes with her recorder, and the new stars ahead of them that had no human names yet. Then he typed 2 words, the same 2 words, because they were still true and they would keep being true, and that was the whole point. Routine transit completed. He submitted the log, set down the pen, and looked out at the stars. The galaxy spread before them, vast, ancient, full of wonders it had spent thousands of years accumulating, and the ship sat inside it the way a key sits in a lock. Small, precise, and exactly where it needed to be. Humanity had not asked the galaxy's permission to be here. They had simply arrived.